Speaking of reliability, a podcast with good friends talking with you about reliability engineering topics. Welcome to Speaking of Reliability. This is Fred Schenkelberg.
This is Enrico Belmonte. Hello, Fred.
Hello, Enrico. Good talking to you again. Just before we got started, we're talking about gardening and listening to our, nature. And when this plant blooms or this thing does something, those are signals to us to do stuff. And if only we'd pay attention to it. But we also talked about well, how do you use the data that you have, and what data do you should have, and stuff like that. And those are our indicators a lot of times for making decisions and doing stuff. And so it's and I also saw a post the other day that I responded to, was on MTBF, and that it was like, it was in some circumstances, under some assumptions, or MTTF, I think, is they're making the argument for, it is a good use of data. And I'm like, we need to talk about this.
Okay, so I know you are not a good friend of MTBF or MTTF,
Well, I don't think it's personal. It's just that if you're going to
No.
actually use it for something, then you need to think about it.
Yeah, it's not personal, but is a good reason why you're not friend of that. But I
Mhm.
think I agree with you. We have a lot of data when compared to just a couple of years ago, and
Mhm.
is now the question is how can we leverage on this data, right? And I would like to discuss about you on this topic.
Well, what kind of data? I mean, are you getting stuff back from your fielded products, or are you? Because I know a lot of cars now have all kinds of instruments that collect information. Even the printer, an inkjet printer, has a chip in it that says how many times did this nozzle spit ink, and it keeps track of how often it's used and stuff like that. Is it that kind of data or something else?
Yeah, I would say we can quickly discuss what kind of categories we have in terms
Mm-hmm.
of data. Maybe people who are listening can also complete this list. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
So let's say the first data source that comes into my mind is about the usage behavior.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah, that's quite a huge amount of data that way to be processed for understanding how components and products that are on the field are used.
Mm-hmm.
And that is helping a lot in terms of reliability, because reliability is always a comparison between load and load capacity, load bearing capacity. And you need to focus on both these two, let's say, categories in order to do good reliability analysis. And in many cases, the load part was just investigated too quickly, just made in some assumption years ago, and taking that for granted for like 20 years.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've run into that a whole bunch of times. Uh, I worked with the team that was making a game controller, and they used, it wasn't somebody made an assumption. They used the vendor's claim of how often a button could be pushed, and the vendors were pick a random button. It was a dome switch basically, and they said it will survive 1 million cycles. And he says,
Hmm.
well, that's great. But these guys, every time they came up with a new product, a new way they mounted this thing, they would set up a device and punch it 1,000 or 1 million times just to verify that it could. And I asked the question, which I didn't think any of these people ever did. It was like, well, how often does the customer push that button? And they're like, we don't know. And I was like, if it's like, one of the buttons was to connect to the Wi-Fi, to connect the game controller to the game console. And I know from experience, you don't do that very often. You do it like at the start of a session, or when you first get the setup or whatever. It's pushed like 20 times. Why are you spending 3 weeks and all this money to push it 1 million times? And they all kind of looked at me like, It's just what we do.
Yeah, this is kind of conservative approach. You say, okay, let's consider the people is going to use this button like I don't know once a day. Let's say once a day, 365 days for a year, and then let's multiply over 10 years, and you
A
get the
number,
number.
and then
Yeah,
you might say we'll do it, and then we'll put a buffer in it and call it twice a year. And then I asked them the trigger button. I said, watching my kids play, is that button gets pushed a lot. Unlimited supply of ammunition for this one game. They were just pushing all the time. And like, is that a million or more? And they're like, I don't know. And it kicked off this basic idea of, well, how do people actually use this stuff? And I've talked about it other times, but unless you start understanding it, why you're doing what you're doing, and it's based on the loads or on the frequency of use or some actual data, um, it's hard to tell. And I think a follow-on to that type is the environmental stresses. There's one thing for how the customer actually uses it, but where do they use it? Which
yeah, that's another point. But I would say one perspective change that people get when working with connectivity is that by definition, you need to move from deterministic approach, saying, okay, let's assume that this button was used like 1 million times. You need
Mhm.
to move from this deterministic approach to a stochastic approach where you have a distribution.
Yeah,
As soon as you have a distribution, you have two ways. The first way is to consider the whole distribution in the calculation, which is a little bit, let's say, more advanced. Or you can say, okay, I'm going to cover just this part of the distribution, assuming, for example, like 50th percentile, 80th percentile, assuming that is the user that I'm going to cover.
right.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And that's, and it allows you to do a better set of trade-off. Instead of hitting a point estimate saying, oh, we need to do 874,216 buttons, pushes, and that's it, and we're good. Then it becomes, if we know that that represents the 70th percentile, it says, well, what about that other 30%? How important are they? How many are there? What kind of types of users are those? Will they buy a new device, or will they, do a warranty claim? You can start having better discussions if you have a distribution of the use conditions. Same with weather, right?
Yeah, yeah. This is a perspective change because as soon as you have distribution, you need to work with statistics, and you need to also to empower people using statistics
Mhm.
and new kind of tools that were not used to do before.
Well, I
That's
I
why it's
always look at
interesting.
them. I always tout the mechanical engineers because they're taught, at least they used to be. I'm not sure anymore. Stress strength analysis. So if they didn't know, they would use a triangle distribution or a square distribution or something like that, and then they would work it out. And it was part of their thinking. And so giving them better information of that, the stress distributions enables them to do a better job at doing their calculations and estimates.
Yeah. And there's a second point I want to highlight. You just mentioned the point that environmental condition also are not constant, but they change, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you have a distribution for environmental condition. You have a distribution for the load, and probably this load is not just depending on one parameters, but multiple parameters. So
Right.
the story can be much more complicated, and this is where a lot of unsupervised learning, clustering, all this kind of statistical approach finds a good approach for reliability engineers.
Oh, yeah.
And let's say when compared to just a couple of years ago, that was not the standard to apply all these the statistical tools, but now is essential to catch how
Mm-hmm.
the part behaves.
Well, it was, I don't agree that it's a recent thing. I mean, I was working with a team 25 years ago that was, it was looking at, say, just something simple as temperature and humidity. And just knowing the world average temperature and humidity, or the region of the world that you sell your product, isn't good enough because people living near the coast have a different temperature and humidity than the folks living, say, 500 miles away
Yeah.
in the mountains, and they're in the same country. And so it's where are your customers? So we started adding not only temperature and humidity distributions, but how did that distribution change depending on where you were? And then it wasn't hard to find. There's plenty of census data out there that say, oh, most people in the world, at least I did a study in the US, and is vast majority of our population lives along the coast. And so we said, all right, 80% of the population lives within so many miles of the coast, and here's the weather for that strip of area. And then there's so many people that live like in Denver and the high altitudes and high
Hmm.
plains, and they here's a percentage for them. And I think we ended up with 5 different groups that covered, say, 95% of our customer population. But we started pulling different data sets in to adjust those uh, uh, to environmental stresses depending on where they actually lived and where they were. And yeah, it's not perfect. We didn't know, to the person how many lived in Denver and how many lived in Albuquerque, but we had a lot better than just saying, oh, overall in the US, here's the grand average. And it just
Yeah.
wasn't useful because it was too crude of a measure, which was a
Yeah.
big step up from when they just said, make sure it works at 40C. I'm like, okay.
Yeah.
How many people are getting that?
Yeah, yeah, that's the second question. As soon as you have the distribution, you can decide whether you want to cover all the distribution or you want to treat your consumers differently. So distinguishing between what are the normal user from the extreme users, and
Mhm.
for this reason, the product could be also adjusted depending on what part of the population should be addressed. Yeah.
Well, just to make it relevant for folks, is one of the things we learn in breaking it down by type of user, where they live, what kind of environmental stresses, and having all of the distribution type data of not perfect data by any means, but we had distributions for a lot of this stuff. Um, we could make the argument that it was worth putting a humidity sensor in the printer,
Hmm.
and instead of the print time relying on that it's the most humid atmosphere or stress, and it takes X amount of time for a page to dry before you print the next one. And so we found that while some people lived, a lot of people lived near the coast and humidity was typically higher, it was penalizing people that lived in lower humidity areas. And
Hmm.
and there was an advantage to people having the printer not artificially wait a long time for the dry. When it's a drier environment, it dries real fast. So we were able to say adding this component and functionality added this benefit overall to our system, and it was a financial reason for doing it. And that came from understanding that not everybody has 80% relative humidity all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. And you touch another important point I would like to discuss with you about data. So you need, for products, in order to be connective, they need to be to be developed on a certain infrastructure in terms of connectivity, cloud, hardware, and so on. And
Mm-hmm.
everything it has a certain cost.
Oh, yeah, yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Despite the fact that I don't think that in the future product will not be connected because it's an advantage, to my opinion. Um, have you ever provided a business case proving that equipping products with uh, connectivity infrastructure um, turned out to be a beneficial choice in terms of cost benefit ratio?
Um, the best one I ever did got shot down by the lawyers concerned about data privacy because, and this was a long time ago, when moving stuff there wasn't a strong Wi-Fi network around everywhere,
Hmm.
kind of thing. And so the cost was a cell service kind of thing. And the issue was is that the protocols for security of those things, for somebody being able to take over your device or to gather data that they don't really shouldn't have access to, stuff like that, wasn't strong enough. The benefit to the engineering teams and the benefit to the customer because of like maintainability and the choice was, do we put a bunch of information on the device to say we're going to track this data and it's time to change your brakes, for example, just making up a
Hmm.
different product and story. Whereas the the risk that was posed by the data security was real. And that, it wasn't part of the team I was working with to look at the security part of it, but we had to agree that that was a significant risk and not worth doing. So we came up with a different compromise. It, while it was valuable in and of itself for the engineering team and back for the customer was the basic argument we're making, it wasn't a good business decision because of the environment at the time, because of the security environment.
Okay.
So
Okay. Yeah. Please finish up.
it's not in isolation. Yeah, we'd love to instrument it all up, and I agree with your point that um, it has to have a benefit. Let's not collect a whole pile of data for nothing that we're never going to look at, or we don't know how to interpret, or we don't have time to deal with this terabyte of data a day that shows up. Let's pick and choose what is actually beneficial. And it was, I'm using brakes as an example. It was kind of a concept of preventative maintenance or predictive maintenance, where we were going to monitor how often and how hard braking occurred, and we knew the wear pattern for this particular giving the different kinds of loads and frequency, we could predict fairly accurately when that wear pattern was going to need to be replaced, when it was going to need to be serviced. And we thought that was a great benefit, a nice feature, and all this other stuff. And yeah, we could have done it, but it just didn't make sense at the time. And I think capture and data permissions and stuff like that, I think still faces a privacy issue all around the world. And it has to be a very clear benefit to the customer. Otherwise, I'm not going to click, you can share my data.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. But you mentioned the word benefit for the customer, and
Mm-hmm.
it's definitely the usage of data can reveal some customer benefit.
Mm-hmm.
But what about also the benefit you can create internally in a company? Yeah, if you know how the product are used, then you can tailor also the test.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And the testing part, especially in the reliability verification part at system level, is one of the most expensive phases in the product development process.
Mm-hmm.
And if you can tackle that by saying, hey, the assumption you have done like 20 years ago is not current anymore. We need to update it
Mm-hmm.
with the distribution, that has a huge impact. So I would not neglect the internal benefit you can generate working with user data.
Oh, I agree. And there's other ways to, deal with the privacy and communication things and also the cost of installing it. If you're going to make a million widgets, do you really need a million data points? Or could you,
Yeah.
enroll people in a program that they they explicitly say, yes, you can add this extra device to my system and monitor it and report it. And and then I know Hewlett Packard with inkjet printers did that with the Hewlett Packard folks did it with different products, and like the inkjet printers, they would enlist 1,000 people in different situations to be part of that data collection base, and they would run that for a couple of years, and they would get all kinds of wonderful information, but they didn't need to spend the money for sensors and data collection and analysis for the millions of widgets they sold.
So you mean they did a randomized experiment, let's say, taking some just like a sample of people
Mhm.
or of printers without sampling everybody,
Right. Yeah. They
And
did. It was kind of a random sample. I think it was,
yeah,
kind of guided for where the population and what types of users. It was a little bit more controlled and completely random. You also needed and it was a bit biased. Everybody agreed is that these were people that agreed to have this happen. And the benefit to them is they got free ink,
yeah,
which
okay,
is a pretty expensive part of printing. So we
yeah,
suspect
yeah,
they were
yeah.
a bit heavier users than they would have usually been, which
And
was
that's a
it's
point
okay.
that we should not neglect. So the selection bias or the bias that we can introduce in data analysis. Yeah.
Hmm.
For example, a lot of connected products are the high-end products or the most expensive one.
Hmm. Hmm.
And when you analyze them, you should be able to prove that people using the high-end products, they behave in a similar way as the majority that doesn't
See, I would
buy
challenge
yeah.
that. You need to, you know, take a look at demographics and take a look and do some sampling, do some observation. And I think part of it too is it's not our job solely as the reliability folks to do this. It's get a hold of the marketing folks, get a hold of the customer service folks, get a hold of the other teams that would also benefit for having this information.
Yeah,
Um, so but that's just two of them, and we've gone 20 minutes already. And I'm like, wow, I'm sure. And we hinted at test data, and there's field return data.
yeah,
Um,
these are different two different categories we can discuss in another podcast.
yeah.
But I would say so. We have start discussing a really huge topic, which is using of connectivity data,
Hmm. Hmm.
highlighting also pitfalls that might arise by using this data. It's
Hmm.
not
Hmm.
like you can use it without thinking too much. Yeah, there are some bias that can really impact the results of your investigation. So I would like to hear also from the listener to this podcast if they face this kind of issues when working with connectivity data. It would be great because I
Oh,
think
that
that
is.
statistics in reliability and application of statistical approaches also in terms of selection bias could be a great enrichment for reliability engineers.
Oh yeah, no, I totally agree, and no, I agree. If you're listening to this and you're saying, "Well, here's how we handle this. Here's the types of things we're doing. Here's this, workarounds over the security issues or permission deals, and how beneficial it is for all the parties involved." We'd love to hear the success stories, or if you just getting started looking at this kind of options, let us know what kind of hurdles you're seeing. What kind of questions do you have? As you know, we always look forward to listener questions. So head over to accendoreliability.com/go. Uh, accendoreliability.com/go/SOR. That's the URL. And a couple ways to get in touch with us. Enrico and I are available, as well as the other hosts of the show, through LinkedIn and our About pages. And that I don't track how many questions we get. We just kind of go, "Oh, that's a cool one. I'm going to answer that question and maybe talk about it in a podcast. Maybe I should."
Yeah, 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 definitely. That's a good idea, Fred.
All right. Well, thanks so much for bringing this one up, Enrico.
Yeah.
And I think we're going to have a whole series of episodes on just data and data analysis and collecting data, types of data, so on. So I look forward to those discussions.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity, Fred.
All right. Talk to you later, Enrico.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks for listening to Speaking of Reliability. We invite you to join the conversation. If you have a question or a topic that you think we should discuss in a future show, please let us know. You can find a comment box below the episode show notes, or just leave a note as part of a review on iTunes.